What is their archetype? So we heard about wide versus narrow, all right? If you haven't gone down that rabbit hole, good luck. It's fun, all right? But you're going to have your narrows and your wides. Narrows, kind of as Ian was talking about, right? They're springy. They have really good spinal engines, all right? My wides, they're more muscle driven, all right? You're going to see two different types of organization when you run, right? My narrows, they're going to be more out here, right? They're going to be springy. They're going to have good kind of spinal engine work. My wides, they're going to run more like this. They're going to spend more time on the ground, right? Now, before I went down this rabbit hole of ISAs, I probably effed up a lot of athletes, right? Because how many of us for a long time were like, nope, we got to sit on the ground and go, right? Put mini bands around them. Yeah, we've all done that, right? But after learning about wide versus narrow, using the 1080 stuff, now it's kind of like, okay, I'm just going to shut up and let them do their thing and try to clean them up in other aspects, okay? And the big thing, we've heard about it a little bit. I've heard somebody already use the term superpower. How do they play? How do they run? What way do they learn? All right? At the end of the day, we want to use the individuality of the athlete to help them, right? Somebody comes to me with a superpower, I don't want to dose them with so much kryptonite that now they can't play, all right? If I got a top prospect, I'm going to go outside and I'm going to watch them play the game. How do they move? How do they run? How do they hit? How do they throw? Right? That's crucial information that I need to write a program. What kills speed? All right? Hamstring injuries. Eric kind of mentioned a little bit. Like, we have a whole hamstring mitigation group. The idea is I want to identify players who are at increased risk of a hamstring injury. I want to get in front of that. Let's ID that with our evaluation right away. All right? We know sprinting can be a vaccine, right? Sprints above 92% of, all right, around 92% of max velocity, all right? That's what's going to help us prevent these hamstring injuries, all right? There's a really fancy, by Chris, the Sprint Mechanics Assessment Score. That's kind of, we have a very dumbed down version of that we use to create our hamstring mitigation group, all right? And lastly, poor pelvic control, right? So we know excess anterior pelvic tilt, right? Ian touched on it a little bit. Being in this late swing phase, backside dominant, that's like 90% of all baseball players, right? That's going to increase the tension on the hamstring. That's going to increase our muscular injuries. 1080 GPS, what are they good at? What are they not good at? How do I group and bucket the athletes? And then test, retest. The single best thing that the 1080 did for me in 2019 is it made me start crossing stuff off my playbook for speed. Oh, that didn't actually work, all right? At the same time, I got exposed to a lot of like wacky, like David Weck shit, right? And then you start to look at it and you see all these graphs come up and you go, oh, shit, that worked, all right? It wasn't just an Instagram thing. But that's the fun part of like trial and error, right? I can try something, that probably won't work. Oh, damn, that worked, all right? And then you start to create your playbook of what works and what doesn't. The biggest single change that I've probably made in the last 3 years is probably moving away from more of track and field base, all right? And we can talk about that when we get over there and I can show you guys drills and stuff. But less drilling, less track and field base, more just sprint, all right? Sprint with less talking, all right? Let them feel. I'm a big feel guy. How did that feel to you? How do we change the feel to you, all right? That way they can be their own coach, because 9 times out of 10 when they're running, I'm not next to them, right? They need to know what works and what doesn't work. So we have different graphs here. A lot of times when I'm looking at asymmetries, all right, I'll look at it through this lens initially through speed, then we'll go to more of a force production side. That way, if it didn't pop on speed, maybe it pops on a force lens, all right? These are 2 different runs here, all right? This guy right here, this is actually me running, terrible form, all right? Terrible asymmetry, all right? And then over here, we have a different graph over here. We can talk about this later. Maybe Dylan will have one that'll look like this as well, all right? But what happens with this, when you get a guy with a double peak up here, that's somebody that's missing mid-stance. They're having some sort of mid-stance issue, all right? So that's typically going to be possibly like, just looking at that could be a narrow who can't access hip IR well because they're ER biased, all right? So you'll see some of that stuff as well. The goal is to make speed simple, right? We have to scale it, right? I need people to be able to access the files that are up here. So at the end of the day, to make this simple, all right, I kind of use the Altus framework a little bit here. So there's 4 big things that we want to focus on. Hip extension, right? Hip flexion, the interaction with the foot and the ground, and then spinal engine. If we can break speed down to this, it's easier to create a playbook for. And it makes it a lot easier on your athletes. Hip extension, all right? So obviously we're looking at this backside, all right? Ian kind of talked about it a little bit with baseball players love to hang out back here, dump up, everything dumps forward, all right? Can they physically get there? All right, what'd your evaluation tell you? Did you get them on the table? All right, can they access or can they not? All right, do we need to make this part of their corrective work, a prep program? All right, what is the quality of that hip extension? And how can we enhance the quality of it? Hip flexion, can they physically actually flex? All right, what's the quality? How can we enhance it? All right, I covered the rest of the text with a slide, sorry. And the velocity, right? Because that thigh angular velocity coming through is going to have a high correlation to their sprint speed, all right? That's also something fancy you can do with the 1080, right? You can get them on there, have them pull through, look at what the thigh angular velocity would be, all right? Being able to measure that has a very high correlation with sprint speed. Interaction with the ground, what is ankle mobility? If I can't dorsiflex, right, probably not going to have good interaction qualities, right? If I'm a narrow ISA, right, do you think I'm going to hit the ground with my toe pointed straight ahead? Probably not, because I can't access hip IR. So I'm going to be more ER biased on mid stance, right? Probably going to have a flatter foot disposition. Is your evaluation identifying all this? So when you go out to the field and you talk to them about sprint speed, you're not yelling at them to keep their toes straight, all right? The individuality of speed is huge. Can they get stiff, all right? That's where we look back at the force plates, right? Can they get stiff? What does unweighting phase look like versus braking phase? Can we actually do that? How can I enhance that in the weight room? Spinal engine, I'm sure you guys have seen this before where the guy with no arms and legs kind of waddles to move himself forward, right? Great example of spinal engine, right? You have pictures of Usain Bolt, right? You have what David Wett calls like the coil, right? Yeah? Gold dot over green dot. What's their ISA, right? The 2 different people are going to move different, right, for spinal engine. This is what a lot of us see, right? We're on Instagram. Ooh, that looks like a cool drill. That looks like a cool drill. How do I implement that, right? And a lot of the stuff I might show you today or over here might look cool, and you might want to run home and do it. And that's kind of the benefit of the 1080 is I can measure it and be, oh, that worked. That didn't work. But at the end of the day, right, here's my plan. Here's reality. We want to make sure that we're setting the athletes up in a situation where they're safe to fail, right? Because it's going to look like this, but we want to make sure it's as linear as possible. We don't want to give somebody something that's going to end up hurting them. If I have somebody in the hamstring mitigation group, am I going to do overspeed running with them? No, right? But contextually, does an overspeed implementation of a drill possibly help that athlete, right? Because he might not be able to access X, Y, and Z because that's what his evaluation says. That's how you're watching him run, right? You don't have to just use assisted sprinting just to try to limit the governor effect, right? To make somebody neurologically be able to run faster, right? There's other avenues to utilize that, and we can discuss that. First thing I think of when I build a program, what is sticky, right? We've all heard of the book, right? Made to Stick, right? I always think of that. What is sticky? I don't want to give an athlete a drill that I know has very little carryover and that is not sticky enough. After I explain it to the group, they all go do it, and everybody just did it wrong. It had no effect whatsoever on the intended purposes. So I want to make sure that when I'm thinking about down here, hip extension, hip flexion, interaction with the ground and spinal engine, I'm picking drills that are sticky enough that when I remove myself from the situation, they can still do it right, and they understand contextually that it was intended for hip extension, right? I don't want to give them something and then pull the group back up together. What'd you guys feel? I don't know, right? All right, absolutes. Exposure to high intensity running and sprinting within 5 to 7 days. I do not want to go more than 5 to 7 days without having my athletes touch high intensity sprinting, right? Because remember, that is a vaccine, all right? That's going to prevent hamstring injuries. We always want to account for workload. We make informed decisions on our sprinting on a weekly basis, right? Don't dose with too much kryptonite. I want to dose them with kryptonite. I don't want to dose them with so much kryptonite. I think you were talking about, Ian, about the narrow who went on a heavy load and looked fine, right? Right? Is a narrow designed to handle high loads, right? No, right? But if it looks good, then go ahead. Keep them out of that kryptonite. Like, they can have exposure to it, but we don't want to do high doses of it that strips them of their superpower. Like I've talked about, how can I scale the system? Everything I do has to be scalable. If you can do it individually, great. If you're a solo person, solo show, awesome. I used to be that. But it quickly scaled, and I got 3 locations, and I got a bunch of coaches I got to coach, right? And I want the same quality done at every single spot and across the board. How can we individualize this even on a scale? And how can we transfer this to the weight room and vice versa? So here are the groups, right? I snuck the numbers in here, right? You do not have to write all this down right now. I'll send the slides if you want them. Plus Matt should have them, all right? These are the numbers that we use to group our athletes. This is very important. The numbers that I have on these slides may not work for you. Understand that. My data set is my data set. You got that? All right. So if I'm working with a bunch of high schoolers and that's all I work with and that's all the data that I have, I'm not going to compare my data set to that of whatever Les Spellman gives me for his elite sprinters and his NFL Combine guys. That doesn't jive. Okay? That's very important for you to understand. If I'm looking at my data set and it is only GPS data versus 1080, that is drastically different. All right? So your numbers will change with your data. The important thing is how are you placing your data to then group your athletes. All right? And as long as you're always running your data against your data, you're good. Right? If I don't have a 1080 and all I have for load velocity profiles is sleds and timing gates, great. That's your data set. Run with it. Do it. Like, that's how you're going to train them. Yeah. When we profile, I go right leg in front, and we just do a 2-point stance. 2-point stance, right leg in front. All right? We go right leg in front because we're baseball players, right? If I'm setting up the steal, which leg am I going to then drive off of to run that way? Because we run in one direction, right? I'm going to end up doing some sort of directional step, right? Or some redirection to get to a good shin angle, and it's always going to be an initial drive off my right leg. So we test off right leg only. So before we look at the graphs, what do you guys notice about his running form? Think about the 4 things we talked about. What do we got? Huh? He needs more projection. What do we got? Think about the buckets. We got 4 buckets. Hip, right? Interaction with the ground, spinal engine, right? Hip flexion, hip extension. Come on, I'm trying to make you guys the experts. I don't want to have to just talk.
He needs more spinal engine.
He needs more spinal engine?
Yeah.
So he's definitely a compressed narrow, I can tell you that. Yeah. Did anybody look at his feet when he ran? So when I watch somebody run, I go ground up, always. Did anybody notice what his feet were doing? Think compressed narrow. What doesn't he have good access to as a compressed narrow? Huh? ER. So he's biased towards ER. He lacks IR capacities, right? So his toes were really splayed out when he ran. All right. You have flatter feet, right? No? Maybe?
They might look flat.
They might look flat, but they don't play flat? Yeah. All right. So we know right away, like, there are some nuggets that we can pick up and try to work into, like, his prep routine, right? More access to IR, all right? More access to IR. I would immediately, because of that, check, like, big toe extension, right? Because he might not be able to get that good push because he's had that compensation. So if you create a system with constraints, you can know a lot about somebody without actually putting them on a table. See what I'm saying? What else did he not have a lot of? Backside was pretty decent, right? Hip extension was kind of decent, right? What didn't he have a lot of in the sprint? Flexion, right? Okay. So we'd probably put him on a table, check access to that. What does that look like? Once again, there's another nugget we can individualize his prep work with. Okay. All right. Now let's go to the graph. And for context, every player I've always worked with, they love looking at this. All right. So it's sprint, come over, let's look at the graph real quick. All right, because there's enough of a break time between each run that we can make this happen. All right, so if we look at his numbers, all right, so RF on this last one was 50.8, so that checks the bucket. I know he's good with horizontal projection. All right, we had negative 7.4 DRF. That's pretty high. All right, so definitely needs some top velocity work there. And yeah, Pmax is at 17, so that's a little low. You'll notice what happens here is like there's settings, okay? So we have steps, and this has basically been smoothed out a little bit, all right? And what I want you to look at is the first thing I look at, and we noticed he was pretty good at horizontal. If your athlete isn't achieving within the first 10 yards, right, roughly about 50% of their speed, 80% of their speed within the first 10 yards, then you know something's immediately wrong. I always like to make sure that our first step is definitely above this 5 miles per hour mark. And then we know this is what? He started with his right or his left? Which one? Right? So this is right, that's left, that's right, that's left. So now I can count them off and I can see what asymmetries might occur. Right? Where do you guys notice an asymmetry kind of pops? What yard marker? How long does it roughly take an average person to reach top end speed or for acceleration to truly like diminish? Roughly. Between what zone? Roughly about 15 to 20 yards, you're going to see acceleration limited drastically for team sports. All right? So here, roughly in that, close to that zone, he's a little early. All right? We can start to really see this asymmetry pop, right? So he's definitely more of like that later acceleration transitional group. So I'm going to train him with like my group 2, group 3 guys. And then the great thing with the 1080 for that group specifically, that late transition to, or late acceleration transitional group, is to go over, and if you guys don't know how to do this, we can play around with it, but so I would say for him, speed, so at around like 12 miles an hour, I'm probably going to kick in load, all right? So I'll use the 1080 where he starts out with no load. As he's running, I'm going to make sure his VDEC hits at a certain number so that the load kicks in. And he has to continue at that speed to drive acceleration and use his body and organize at that speed. Let's have him start at 3 at 12 miles an hour. Let's bury him and kick him in at 15. The important thing when you do this, though, is you want the feedback from the athlete. Where did the load kick in? Because you want to make sure that you're getting the right distance. So you're going to start with nothing, and then hopefully if we did this right around this area, you should kick in. All right? He's not going to feel really anything except for he's going to feel like he's running in slow motion. What did you notice immediately happened differently at this zone that didn't happen earlier? He had more, he had more hip flexion. All right? Did I give him a cue? Did I speak? No? Right? So that's the great thing. And if you turn around and look at the graph, look at that. The peaks and valleys are now symmetrical. To me, that's one of the greatest things about the 1080 is it's your ability to access that group 2, group 3 range. Like it plays great at top end and it plays great at acceleration, but like the party trick of actually the variable loading is game changer. All right? And it's also a game changer because I can, on the flip side of that, I can go heavy and I can kick the load off. Right? If I have somebody that's just purely, you look at him like, man, your first 2 steps suck. Like, but I don't want to load them the whole time. Like just load them so they have the load until I reach the velocity of around the first 2 steps. And guess what? You have access to that information. Right? And it doesn't take a lot. Like, it's just, you're standing there just making the changes as your players are rolling through. One thing I did want to tell you guys that really helps out with those athletes that are more the drivers, right? They don't have, they lack a lot of flight time, right? You see them spend a lot of time on the ground. The thing that I've been playing around with a lot that I've seen more success with is skip for distance, all right? Skip for distance, if you see somebody that is having limited access to hip extension, it's the single most thing that I've seen in the past 2 years that has allowed people to get into that hip extension and feel the glute, all right, and really push through the ground for a long period of time. So I've done resisted skip for distance on here. We've had some players where they spend a lot of time on the ground. They're those guys that, Eric talked about it earlier. You kind of look at the ISA, right? They got a wider pelvis than up here, right? The compression forces aren't there, so everything goes and sinks. So with those guys, doing like assisted like skip for distance or assisted bounding will clean up their mechanics very easily. And that's something that like I don't have to worry about him blowing out a hamstring on, right? I'm pulling him at 3 kgs, all right? Just enough to kind of help him get off the ground. Limit those ground reaction forces that are caused by kind of the poor compressive ability of that athlete. So I don't know if you guys remember like the graphs I showed earlier with like the squigglies in the middle of the tops. You got to make sure that you're going in and looking at it through a raw sample to get to that, all right? So it doesn't smooth off. So when I'm doing this, I'm constantly changing screens, like smooth steps, smooth raw, like looking at it through force. We look at his first one through force and let's see how different it was on that. You'll notice now when we look at it through force, like we see a drastically different asymmetry towards that end, all right? So we know something's going on with his body, like one, mechanically it was, but then two, we might even, if this continues to happen like this, then we might know, okay, well, at X velocities, his body's handling higher amounts of force, right, into the ground. So is there something from a tissue capacity standpoint that we need to look into with him? So it allows you to ask a lot of questions. That's why I love this software. So.